Hi, my name is John Roberts. I'm the director of Callanwolde Art Center's clay program. Today I'd like to show you a demonstration on how to throw a bottle. I wedged up this clay, and wedging is a process where you basically knead the clay to get air bubbles out of the clay body, also get it moving in the right direction, basically circular or spiral pattern. So it helps you out while you're throwing the clay on the wheel. This is the wheel. All wheels are basically the same. They've got a wheel head that turns. There's a motor underneath and a pedal that helps you control the speed. And as I start out, I'm going to be going pretty fast, and then as I'm throwing the form and it's in its final stages, you'll see me slow the wheel down as it's spinning on the wheel. Now you want to make sure that the clay is really secure on the wheel head, because if you don't, this thing could go flying off and hit your neighbor or make a mess. So you really want to make sure that the clay is pounded down onto the head really secure. And I do a little added thing that I like to teach, where I'll take the throwing sponge and run it around the seam of that clay right at the base. Get a really good stick onto the wheel head. And now that's really firm and secure. That's not gonna go anywhere. All right, so the first step in throwing is centering. This is probably the hardest part, and this is the first part that you're going to learn as you're throwing on the wheel. And the basics of centering are making sure that your body is really firm and not moving around. Your arms need to be really tense. You're pushing one hand in towards the center. Sometimes one hand is on the opposite side, pushing in and adding resistance to center the clay and cone it up. And then there's another process where you'll be pressing it back down, back into the center, into a mound shape to prepare it for throwing. Now I'll be doing this a couple of times to make sure that I can still feel that there's a little bit of a twist down there at the base. So I'll go ahead and cone that back up. And what that's doing is that it's working that twist all the way up to the top where I can control it easier. Get that really nice and centered at the top, and then force that back down and center it in that mound shape. If I'm lucky, sometimes it only takes a couple of times, but it all depends on how well I wedge the clay, and if there's any air bubbles that develop. Sometimes that happens while you're wedging, but that's easy to cure through this process of centering the clay on the wheel. So it looks like one more time to get the clay up, coning it up. And as you can see, I've got a lot of slip. This is called slip on my hands. That's gonna help the clay kind of move freely against my hands. Sometimes I'll add a little water to the clay, and then push it back down. Throwing, like any process, is something that requires a lot of practice, like anything. The more you do it, the better you'll get. The more you'll get used to sitting at the wheel, using this tool in an efficient way, and how you react to it. Your body in particular, how you sit at the wheel, your hand position. You'll find particular ways that work for you. As I teach, I'm teaching you my hand positions that work for me. And the basics of throwing are pretty much the same all across the board. If you're looking online, reading books about throwing, but you'll find as you go and get better at it that you'll find different hand positions work better for you. So I've got the clay down to a mound shape. Now this is going to be really easy to control. The clay is really compact, ready to go. Second step is called dropping the hole. And I want to position my fingers so that I'm creating the hole of the pot. I may have to add a little more slip to my fingers. There we go. And this is going to determine how deep that hole is, or rather how thick the base is. And I'm going for about 1/4 inch for this bottle. So that pretty much opens drops the hole. Now I want to open up the base. And the trick to cylinders, anything tall, is that you want to open up the bottom part and actually undercut underneath this thick part of the clay. So the opening will come underneath that and end up somewhere over here. So my finger is going to rest down onto the base, and like a record player needle, it's just going to sit right down on the base and not dig in, and it's going to drag and pull that floor out. But notice that the top circle, this top circle, is remaining pretty much in its original shape. Okay, so that opens up the floor. And now it's time to compress that floor. And this is a really important part and something not to forget, because after you open up the floor, you're spreading out those little tiny clay particles. And for a good strong base, you want to make sure that all of that clay is nice and compact. And that will prevent some of the issues of cracking during the drying process of the clay. All right, so I'm just taking my sponge, my throwing sponge, and starting in the middle, adding a little pressure, and then dragging across. You can kind of hear that clay compress. And then coming right back to the center. For forms that are flat, like plates, low bowls, sometimes you'll be doing this quite a few times, just to make sure that that base is really tight and secure. All right, that's good to go. Now I've got a really good undercut underneath there. So that's pretty deep. I've got an undercut over here on this side. So now I'm ready for my first pull. Now, like I was centering, I want to pull the form into a cone shape, and that ensures I get the most amount of clay height as I'm throwing. If I throw straight, there's a possibility that the form is going to start straight, but then end up getting wider at the top and smaller at the bottom. And at some point, once it starts going out, you're going to lose your height or the ability to gain height. If you keep it in a cone shape, you can keep on going until you run out of clay and get a really good tall cylinder. So, first thing I want to do is line up my fingers. My inside hand, kind of positioned like that, kind of like a claw. And I've learned that my thumb and that middle finger there, whenever I do this, they always line up. So wherever my thumb lands, that's my mark for where my outside hand is going to go, and my outside fingers, right underneath that bevel there. So the hand position is kind of like this. It grabs the clay, and that's called the bead of clay, and that's what this is right here. That's what I'm going to be pulling up. That grabs the clay and then guides it all the way up. So I'm never squeezing my fingers together. That'll thin the walls out too fast and probably tear your clay off of the wheel. So I just want to add enough pressure that I feel that I've picked up that clay. And then I can move it all the way up to the top. I like to give my students the analogy of surfing, even though I've never surfed before, but it's the idea that you catch a wave, and the wave being the bead, and then you ride it all the way up to the top. And that helps students to not get in the habit of squeezing the clay together, because that's not the action. It's pulling and pushing and getting the right amount of pressure so that you're right underneath that bead so that it can pull the clay up. So I'm still in the beginning stages of that cylinder, but you can see how much that clay that started here has grown, and the walls have now thinned out. This is the time where I'm going to consider slowing the wheel down, taking my time, trying to be as steady as possible as I make these pulls, because the faster you go, centrifugal force will want to spread out the clay. Another trick is to keep that clay in a cone shape by collaring that opening. And basically what I'm doing is just making a circle with my hands. And then as I push the clay up, I'm making that circle smaller and smaller as it comes to the top. And as you can see, the shape has changed from a straight up and down cylinder to more of a cone or volcano looking shape. And that's going to help me in the long run, because that's going to keep that structure from splaying out. And the hope is that I grab another bead, and as I pull the clay, I'll gain a few more inches in height. There we go. That's looking good. Now I'm monitoring how much clay is down here. It's always going to be thicker down here than it is here, and it's always going to be pretty thin right there. So the biggest push at this point is going to be right here, trying to grab that bead. But then remember, riding the wave, you just want to ride the wave, ride the bead all the way up, just control it all the way up to about here, where the clay starts getting a little thicker. That's where you can start pressing in and try to gain some more height. But a lot of that is just letting the clay move and ride up with you as you move your hands up. So let's see, one more pull to get height on this cylinder. So I'm just setting the base here. There's always going to be a little bit of clay that you can't get to. So I just erase that away with the sponge. That's just by taking my finger and the sponge and just making a really nice smooth surface there. That's already creating a nice bead right there. Get my hand back down in there. Push that up. There's the bead. Now I want to control this all the way up to the top. And I want to stay under that undercut. That's good. I purposely leave sometimes not this much clay at the base, but I do leave a bit of a thickness here. I don't cut that away right too soon. I leave that for the end. One is that it stabilizes your cylinder. So if you're working up here on the shoulder and that slows the cylinder down, if you don't have enough clay down here, it'll twist and cause the form to go off center. All right, let's go. Maybe we'll go one more because there's a little bit of clay right there. So see how it's coming out? Just get that back going in. You want to leave enough room for your arm to get in there. All right. So nice and steady. Just keep moving that clay up. All the way up to the rim. All right, so that is those are the steps of trying to get height on a cylinder. You know, this is basically a pot. There's an opening, there's a hole in there. This could contain something, but now I want to do some finishing to this and concentrating on a bottle form. What I'm going to be doing is bellying out the body of the pot, creating a shoulder, and then collaring and pushing this part of the clay inward to create a little bottleneck. First thing I like to do is take a rib, and that's what this tool is. They're made out of different materials. This one's made out of metal. Some of them are made out of plastic. Some of them are wood. I like this one a lot because it's thin and flexible and really sharp, and it gives me a really good profile and line. And I like to smooth out the walls first with the rib. So I'm adding a little pressure Just securing the rib down at the base, adding a little pressure, pushing in with the rib. And then my hands on the inside kind of form a rib too. So that's pushing inward and touching right there, and pushing out against the rib to create some compression. So just like throwing, I'm creating a little bit of a bead to throw the clay up and guide it all the way to the top. Now for a bottle form, I want to make sure that I've got enough clay to play with to make a shoulder and a bottleneck. So I am going to gauge about 1.5 inches of clay to use as the shoulder and the bottleneck. So let's say maybe about right there will be my mark. So everything that I'm bellying out and creating a little more volume will only be from the base up to that mark there. So in this process, it's similar to what I just did, but now I'm going to use a little more pressure with my inside hand pushing out to create a curve. And I'm looking at the profile. I like to teach that you don't want to look at your tool too much. You want to try to develop the ability to look at this line right here as you're throwing. And watch it develop and watch it move into the shape that you want. So there's a little bit of a belly out there, and then it becomes more evident as you go up, and then it comes back in, and then stops right at that line. But I like to continue that push, just a light pressure all the way up to the top, just to make sure that I'm not just gathering clay right at that area. It's still continuing to move and stay uniform. So you can see how the shape has changed. I like how that profile is developing. I'm just gonna add a little more pressure to bring that out just a little more, meet it to the shoulder, and then I'll start working on the shoulder part. So again, getting steady with the tool, pushing out just a little. Coming back in, up to that line. There's my mark. And then a soft pull all the way to the top. That looks really good. Just do a little refinement here so I can start thinking about where I want that shoulder to start. So that line there is about my mark. Okay, so I've got a good amount of clay there. This is gonna color in, and like I was doing before while I was preparing the clay, the basic clay cylinder, I'm gonna get my hands around that circle, and you'll need a little more slip or water right on the surface there so your fingers don't stick to the pot. And it's gonna touch the clay in 3 major spaces on your hand right there, on your finger, right there on your knuckle, inside knuckle, and then on your thumb on both hands. So the trick is to try to maintain a circle as much as possible. And the tendency is that shape there. Your hands want to make a triangle, but if you maintain the circle all the way up, you get a better chance at gathering that clay in a uniform pattern all the way up to the top. The other thing to note is that when you're creating shoulders like this, you always want to make sure that your shoulder is at an angle. If that shoulder starts going 90 degrees or parallel to the wheel head, you're in the danger zone, because the weight of the clay and water is going to want to make that shoulder droop down. So you always want to have an angle upward as you're throwing the shoulder. Now here I'm doing a soft pull, just making sure that the clay is uniform from the shoulder to the neck. And I'm also creating a spot where I'm going to start coning in more to create the bottleneck. So I'll need a lot of clay for that too. So the shoulder is going to stop right about here, that line right there. So I'll concentrate on this area right here as the shoulder, and now this part becomes clay for the bottleneck. You'll also want to take your rib. I think I dropped it in there somewhere. Here it is. You want to take your rib and compress that area right here. Especially if water gets onto it. The nice thing about these sharp ribs, these are Kemper ribs, they also scrape away some of that extra slip that gets on the surface. So that strengthens that shoulder up for you as you're squeezing or pressing in this part and working on the bottleneck. It won't twist your shoulder out of round. All right. So the bottleneck is, I'm starting to see, or the bottle form, I'm starting to see everything kind of rough out and see the shape. Now I want to start working on that bottleneck there. Same thing as I was doing before. I'm just taking my hands and collaring that clay inward, trying to maintain that circle as much as possible. And then do a soft pull up and in to start creating that bottleneck. So I gained a little more area there for my shoulder, and I was expecting that because all that clay now is coming in towards the center. But now I want to get that rib back onto this part here, compress that, get some of that slip away from the shoulder. make that strong so that now when I get back up onto this bottleneck here, this won't sink down. So all I've got is a little ring of clay there, and I'm going to try to grab as much of that as I can to gain a little bit of a cylinder there, a little bit of height. There we go. A little bit of shape on that. And then same thing, that gave me a little more area there. Smooth that out. And then you can refine the bottleneck now. This is actually modified from the Kemper toolkit, and all I did was I cut the end of the rib off on this end, and then I cut it this way, and that made it so that I could just use my little finger and get a really good curve on that when I'm making forms. But then also when I'm getting down to the base of something, I can get right down real close up to the surface, and I don't have this big piece of metal here getting in the way and possibly digging down into the shoulder. That also helps when you're refining the base. Some of the ribs that are made already have this feature or this cutout incorporated into the shape. Those are the mud tools, Sherrill tools, and they're shaped very much like this. But I've always stuck to the metal one, and I think it's because it's sharper. This can cut you when you're cleaning it off, so you have to be careful. And makes a really nice line as you're throwing. All right, that pretty much finishes up the throwing part of the neck, the bottleneck. Now I want to get back down to this base. You can see how much clay is down there. That really helped me out a lot when I was working on collaring this shoulder. That prevented any of this from twisting. But now it's time to cut that away and start refining the foot. So that's where the modeling tool comes in handy. It's this tool with the little point on it, and usually it's made to look like it has two blades. And this can scrape away a majority of that clay inward towards your base. And I like to start out and then work in as I'm cutting this away. And then that ring of clay right there can be recycled and used again. So I just flipped the tool on its back and then scraped it away. And now you can continue to use this tool to trim down some of that clay. Or what I prefer is using the loop tool for trimming and wet trimming away the base of that clay. Let's make sure I've got enough to cut. So just like trimming in the leather hard stage, as the clay is spinning, these blades here will rest onto the clay and then cut the excess clay away. But when you're doing this with wet clay, you have to kind of do it slow, let it cut, and as soon as it attaches to the pot, kind of like that, you gotta manually take it off each time. Because if you try to keep trimming with that clay stuck on there, it's just gonna attach itself and embed itself back onto the pot. And that's really what you don't want. So it's basically like shaving off bits of the clay as you go. And what I'm trying to do is fit that profile to where it was kind of angled in and let it meet that foot. The foot is the base, which will eventually be there. The way that I throw these bottles is with a flat-bottomed base. I do a little bit of trimming, but I like to keep them flat. One is because the way to trim bottles is usually with the use of a chuck, and I don't like how the chuck messes up the shoulder. If I'm doing some major trimming down there, so I'll usually leave that flat at the base with just minimal trimming. Now I'll take the rib and kind of reshape that base there. So there's a little bit of a hump right there I want to work out. I'll put my finger on the inside of that hole there to steady everything. Just compress clay. I made a nice shape. And get back on the rim, and that stretched out the rim of the bottleneck just a little. So I want to set that back into place. And now I'll make use of a chamois, and my chamois is one of the synthetic ones, and these can be picked up at any hardware or automotive store. It creates a really nice smooth surface to finish out rims. If you try to use your sponge, a lot of times it'll leave the area really rough. Because what it's going to do is it's going to scrape away that excess slip and expose the grog in the clay. And the grog is the little clay particles that help keep structure to your clay. And it feels like sand when you're throwing, but it's actually clay, fired clay, fired into or mixed in with the mix of the clay. All right, now to take this off of the wheel, back to my modeling knife. I'm going to scrape off this excess clay here, get it out of the way, and kind of clean up the wheel head here. And I like to create a little bit of a bevel. It creates a nice little shadow. Kind of lifts the form off of the surface. And that little bevel actually folds up and creates a nice little lip, which creates the foot. So sometimes I'll accentuate that even more by angling the tool up just a little. And you can see it's kind of rough right now, but after getting the sponge back on there, that'll smooth right out and create a really nice ring or foot at the base. So I like to drag the sponge out here, get a good grip on it, and then slowly move it in and just kind of buff that area round and smooth. Just like that. And then back to the rib. Remember that area that I cut off? That little corner creates a really nice mark and definition to the foot as I press in. And come out. So that creates a nice line right there. So I like to leave that feature on a lot of my pots because it creates a little bit of a base there so that if I do have a glaze that's really runny or drippy, it has a little stopping point to not end up on the kiln shelf. I'm throwing on the wheel head, so I'm gonna have to eventually take this off of the wheel, but you can throw on what's called a bat. And a bat is something that you place onto the wheel head with bat pins or maybe even clay. And that way you can throw right on the bat, and then when you're finished, you just lift the bat up and put it on your shelf. But in this case, I'm gonna take this directly off of the wheel head, and I'm gonna take the wire tool. It's usually just a piece of wire or string wrapped or tied to 2 sticks. Get it really tight, and then press down onto the wheel head and let it slide underneath while the pot is spinning to get a good circular cut underneath that pot. And then to lift it off of the wheel head, you want to make sure you have dry hands and pick it up from the base. So I'm just going to grab it from the base, give it a little twist and up and off. There it goes. So that's the bottle form. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you come see our classes at Callanwolde Art Center. Thanks.